yapping, but I do think it's important for us to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want
I have a lot of content.
I want to get started. So we'll go ahead and get started. Katie, thank you for being here. There will be other people to trickle in. I know that there's a number of people meeting next door right now that are going to watch the recording later, which is another reason why I wanted to make sure that we had the live stream up and working. So thank you for being here. I'm not going to take any more of your time. But thanks.
Finish time
10:15.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Then we have to pull out together. So go ahead and hand these out. You all are very special. You are the first. Thank you. We just launched this new curriculum. So we had some funding from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection to do some watershed outreach and engagement and to also build this toolkit. So you all get to be the first group that gets the trial run of this curriculum today. So I'm Katie. I use they, them pronouns. I am the executive director of Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light. And so hopefully all of you may be familiar by now. I did speak with you, well, with a group of you back a couple months ago, maybe 6 months ago now.
April.
Was it that long ago?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. So it's been a while, but you all are a member congregation of ours and just recently renewed. We have new membership agreements. And so that's very exciting. We're very glad to have you as part of the PAIPL network. So I'm not going to take time today to kind of dive into the broader details of who PAIPL is and all of that stuff. If you want to learn more about that, I'm happy to chat with you. I think the recording probably still exists out there that I did. So today I wanted to take a little bit of a deep dive into watersheds to talk about this watershed where we live and some of the ways that different religious traditions are thinking about and articulating about water and justice and what we might learn from that in our own practices and lives. All right, so this curriculum that we have is broken up into 3 pieces, and it is designed that it can be done like I'm doing this morning and all in one go, or you could break it down into 3 chunks and spend a lot more time in each section. So if you get the feeling today as we're going through the curriculum that I would love to like spend more time with this, you're welcome to take the booklets home with you or to use them as some part of some kind of education program in a longer format later. But for the sake of today, we're going to move through it so that we can cover each of the sections. So the first section of the curriculum focuses on exploring the different ways that religious traditions orient and talk about water. So Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light is an interfaith organization. So when we started building this curriculum and this toolkit, we were like, let's take a look and a dive into what some different religious traditions, the ways that water is either used or relationship to water is built, or the way that we care and interact with water is framed. So I learned a lot in this exploration. So we're going to take a deep dive into a couple of those now. So in the Baha'i tradition, which if you're interested in learning more about the broader connections between Baha'i teachings and environment, we actually just had a couple of Baha'i leaders come and participate in a program at PAIPL. The link is available on our website. So if you want to know more, there's more there. But Baha'i typically use a ritual hand washing. So many actually religious traditions use water in some kind of ritual cleansing routine, either before prayer or other kinds of spiritual acts. Within the Baha'i teachings as well, there's a lot that talks about the importance of agriculture, and particularly this idea of balance and harmony is something we really see prominently show up in a lot of Baha'i teachings, including this sense of connection to or building relationship or living in relationship to water within our communities. One of their sacred texts that is found, I have the reference for you there, but the text shares that the Almighty Lord is the provider of water and its maker, and hath decreed that it be used to quench man's thirst, but its use is dependent upon his will. If it should not be in conformity with his will, man is not afflicted with a thirst which the oceans cannot quench. So that is just kind of a brief introduction to some of the ways that our Baha'i friends kind of think about water. Our friends in the Buddhist community talk a lot about the pathway to enlightenment, which includes cleansing of the body and the mind and the spirit. Water plays both a physical and a symbolic role within the Buddhist teachings, and often represents a state of serenity or calmness. You'll often see if you go into Buddhist shrines, there's water that is featured in part of the kind of the way that the space is even laid out to provide that sense of calming and serenity. They also place fresh water in front of the Gohonzon every morning. So if you're not familiar with what the word Gohonzon means, it's just a word that kind of describes an object of devotion. And so if you are practicing within the Buddhist tradition, it's very common that you will offer water each morning before that object of devotion that you have. It's also used in burial rituals, which is not exclusive to the Buddhist tradition, but to others as well. The sacred text that we chose to highlight for the Buddhist tradition is this pool of nectar possessing the 8 qualities of pure water. I offer now to all the Buddhas and their retinues. As you accept it, may I and all sentient beings gather the accumulations, purify obscurations, and empty samsara from its very depths. And that is from the Pure Vision, which is one of the Buddhist texts that is followed and practiced. So we can also jump over to Christianity, which may be more familiar to some of you, and maybe you all would have some things to teach me, particularly about how maybe brethren traditions may interact or talk about water. But I also am in the Christian tradition, and so oftentimes water is used to talk about transformation. We use it in baptism, right? The symbolism of death and resurrection. It really is a key element in many of the narratives and the stories that we have within our sacred text. You think about the Moses story, and you think about Jesus and all the time he interacts with water. And so water really does play a key role, even beyond the ways that the biblical text talks about stewardship and things like that. Just as a very basic concept, you really see that weaving of water as a really integral part of many of the different narratives and Bible stories that we have. So sacred text that we pulled out comes from the book of Revelation. Then he said to me, all is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will freely give water from the life-giving spring. So we pulled this example particularly because I think it highlights both the fact that water is being used here both metaphorically and physically. And I think that's one of the recurring themes that you see throughout each of the different religious traditions, is that water is both used in its physical form to help achieve and bring religious community and life together, but it is also used in a symbolic way. And so both of those things are going to be important as we keep building this sense of what do religious traditions say and teach and interact with water. So in the Islamic tradition, so also within the Abrahamic fold, water symbolizes wisdom within the Quran. And this sense that all living creatures originate from the water, which is also something that's familiar to us within the Christian tradition. Water is associated again with this sense of ritual purity. So that also being a consistent theme that comes up over and again in many different traditions. Muslims particularly clean themselves with water before prayer. One piece that we really wanted to pull out is that within Islamic teachings, giving water to another person is a very important act of charity and kindness and goodwill. And that's something that's very explicitly named. So the sacred text that we pulled out says, whenever he sends down water from the sky, and once dry riverbeds are running high according to their measure, the stream carries foam on its surface, and likewise from that metal, which they smelt in the fire in order to make ornaments or utensils, there rises scum. In this way does God set forth the parable of truth and falsehood, for as far as the scum is concerned, it passes away as does all dross, but from that which is benefit to man abides on earth. In this way does God set forth parables. So again, we see this recurring theme, right, of both the symbolism and the physical presence of water being incredibly important to this religious articulation. In Hinduism, water is also sacred. It also holds that ritual sense of purity and purification, and also is believed to have like cleansing powers. Particularly important within Hindu thought and practice is that there are 7 sacred rivers. So within Hindu teaching, the Ganges, which flows from the head of Shiva, along with other rivers that flow through the heart of India, are considered to be incredibly sacred. And those are very important places throughout someone's life. People will often take pilgrimage to those places to pay respect. Both death and bathing rituals are often performed on the banks of those rivers. And oftentimes temples are built either on or around or close by to rivers. So within Hinduism, again, we see this theme of both the physical presence of water and its symbolic, like the way that we hold it symbolically teaches us important things about this particular religious orientation as well. So the sacred text that we pulled out to share with you all was, "Pure may the waters flow over our bodies, that which defiles, I fling it upon our foes. I cleanse myself, O earth, as with a filter." So within the Jewish tradition, which also is in the Abrahamic, so we have Christian, Islam, Judaism, who all fall within widely Abrahamic. So many similar rituals and practices, particularly because we often share sacred texts. But same thing in the Jewish tradition, we have water representing life, cleansing, purification. Particularly important within Jewish thinking and thought is the connection between abundance of rain, abundance of water, and divine blessing. Water also serves as a medium of transition from different ritual states. So similar to the act of baptism, that is all, particularly that immersion is very important within the Jewish tradition. Particularly interesting is that on Rosh Hashanah, which is a Jewish holiday, sins are either metaphorically or literally cast into flowing water as a symbol of starting over and anew. So the sacred text we pulled out was, "May my doctrine, discourse drop like the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like showers upon young growth, like droplets on the grass." And that comes from Deuteronomy, which is a text that is shared also with other traditions, including our own. We also wanted to highlight some religious traditions that maybe aren't as commonly thought about and practiced or are aware of. So contemporary pagans is one of the categories that we added, and they're here on the screen. So at least contemporary pagans don't necessarily share a specific set of beliefs. There's as much variance in practice as there is people. But water rituals and spells are often part of their religious practice and communal practices and teachings. Festivals also often mirror what's happening within the actual seasonal world, so are built around things like the solstice and the equinox. Water, again, being used as this sense of divine blessing or presence, and again, both in its symbolic form as well as its pure physical form is important for both. So we pulled this short text from Carol McWilliams, who shares lifeblood, pour from clouds to earth below, flash flood, won't be denied, cleanse me, relentless flow, shape me, make me, carry me deep within myself. So the final tradition that we pulled out for kind of a deeper glance, and this is by no means a comprehensive listing, but wanted to just kind of provide a starting place to maybe prompt your own curiosity and thinking about how not just our tradition, but other traditions are talking about and engaging with and find water to be a very important part of religious life. So universalism emphasizes the importance of oceans as a source of life and symbol of empowerment. So the connection between Unitarian Universalists and oceans is very strong within the tradition. Although within the tradition itself, people come and practice many different traditions. So it's kind of like an umbrella tradition, if you will. Water serves and actually symbolizes that unifying element that they have of being one group of many different beliefs or faiths or practices. And whenever Unitarian Universalists come together, they often practice a water ceremony that is used during times of communal gathering. So again, we see both the symbolic and the physical presence of water incredibly important to religious life and practice. So We pulled a chalice lighting prayer from the Ministry for Earth from last year. And this is what they share in this piece. We light this chalice in honor of the web of life. We honor this sacred ecosystem of ecosystems we call home. We honor all of our diverse animal, plant, fungal, and insect relatives, and the land, water, and air we all share. May we remember that all life is worthy, all life connected, all life is sacred. So beyond the pure connection that happens between water and our religious practice, which hopefully maybe I've demonstrated a little bit for you by taking that quick ride through different religious teachings, we also know that many of our religious traditions have a strong element of justice or righteousness or truth. And so we wanted to not just focus in on water, but hopefully you'll see in a moment why we're doing this, but where also do our religious teachings invite us to think about justice and right practice. So a couple of thoughts from the different traditions that we just highlighted now. So for Baha'i, humans have a twofold moral purpose, which includes well-being. For those who practice Buddhism, sitting with suffering is part of the pathway to enlightenment. In the Christian tradition, we are invited to emulate Jesus' love and compassion for all people. For Muslims, experiences of human life provide opportunities for the embodiment of divine virtues, including compassion and particularly generosity. In the Jewish tradition, justice puts one in alignment with the wider community and our purpose as humans. For pagans, the deep reverence for nature translates into practices of care for all living creatures, which includes human life. In universalism, we have principles that shape community life, that sense of unity, not of belief necessarily, but of community and practice is incredibly important. And then in Hinduism, even common greetings, so the way that you may greet each other in the street or when you come together in worship community, actually have and convey this sense of there being a need for justice, either between a group of people or into the wider community. So it's kind of like an assertion of like, may all be well. So if we tie these kind of two threads together for a moment, and we consider the importance both of symbolic and physical presence of water within our religious traditions, teachings, communities, along with this sense of there is a call for us to think about justice, to think about the ways in which our actions harm or impact on the lives of our neighbors, non-human creatures, and beyond. We see this important theme kind of emerge, that the way that we interact with water is important already in our traditions, and the way that we care for our land and our neighbors is important. So by bringing these two together, you start to actually kind of see an important connection emerge, which is it is part of our faith tradition to be aware of, to care for, to interact with, and to be aware of what's happening in our community around us, which includes our watersheds and waterways. So I've talked a lot. If this screen comes up for you so you can see. So I pulled a couple of pictures of some of the ways that in my mind I start to visualize how water connects us all, and not just how water connects us all, but maybe where the justice piece really comes into play. So you can see trash, flooding, displaced children living in a refugee camp, drought, pollution in waterways. So those are some of the ways that my imagination, where my brain goes when I think about the connections between these two things, particularly the way that my faith orients me to care about both water and justice. So the question is now for you, because I've been talking for a while. I'm wondering if you want to take a moment to turn to your neighbor, and we'll just pull one of the questions that's in the study guide today, which is, what is something, or what did you learn about water in various traditions? So hopefully this little 15 minutes that we just spent covering traditions, you maybe learn something new to you, whether it's from your own tradition or someone else's. And so you can turn to your partner. We'll take 2 or 3 minutes and then I'll call us back together. Just to explore what's something new that you learned, and why was that important or why did it catch your attention?
Share. But curious about universal considering the ocean primary or well, I'm not sure exactly where when I was a young kid on I went to all like the web of life. All like birds.
Scientifically, maybe, and
Things all connected.
religious.
It's been in my ethical DNA since then. Every time we go to the farm, the fish are all the way around. They're playing ball, ball goes up on the shore. You know, that's how I like emerged on land.
Okay.
To get their ball.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm. But it's still fine. Then I my like it. Given that
All right, final 30 seconds.
The water is all. Let's try to think. Purification or ways to get from one state to another. And all the sort of stopping and thinking about this.
We were on our own. I'll point out.
As a uses.
Yeah. Winter time.
Abolish it.
I still not sure it's adequately their desert areas.
Yeah.
And they know what it's like out there.
Yeah.
Primary intention. Yeah. Somebody works through the lessons and that. I mean, go together. And I didn't know why. At least we can 35.
All right.
So,
So some folks came in after I already shared this, but this curriculum is new to PIPL, it's fresh, hot off the press. And so it's designed to be used in a number of different settings. We have a very short time today, but hopefully you'll take these discussions and continue them well beyond our time that we have today. So hopefully through what I shared in section number 1, you get a bit of a sense that our own tradition and the wider interfaith community, there are deep connections with water and also with justice that require us to pay a little more careful attention. And so if that is the case, then the place we need to start is by knowing what is our watershed. So a watershed, who is familiar with what a watershed is, or for whom is the term watershed a new term? Great. So I have a short video that I'm going to play in just a second that will talk a little bit more about watersheds, but essentially a watershed, the curriculum talks about it as an area of land that sheds water into a specific body or place of water. I often like to talk about it like a bathtub. So if you think about water comes down out of your faucet, right, when you turn the shower on, and it all ends up going where eventually? Down the drain. And so watersheds work in a similar way. Any rain that falls over a particular area or any water that is remaining with a particular area eventually makes its way down into one central point. And so that is the area that we define as a watershed. Now, watersheds can be defined broadly. So we'll talk a moment about how we live within the country.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Can be defined broadly by the fact that we're in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but you can go down even further than that into sub-watersheds and then into smaller tributaries. So there's a whole map I can show you in just a moment. So A River Reborn, which is a wonderful presentation that I encourage folks to look up and engage with, says this about watersheds, that watersheds are nature's drains, funneling water as it becomes creeks, streams, and eventually into our rivers. Throughout its journey, the water picks up different materials, soil, sediment, and pollutants. So that's going to be really important in just a moment.
What is a watershed? Is it a shed that holds water? Nah, try again. A watershed is all of the land that drains into the same location or body of water. People tend to think only of water bodies such as rivers, lakes and wetlands as being part of their watershed. However, any land, whether it is park, farm, forest, school parking lot, and even the soil we build our homes on is also included. Think of a watershed as a funnel, collecting all the water within a specific area and draining into the nearest body of water. Drop by drop, water is channeled into soil, groundwater, creeks and streams, making its way to larger rivers and eventually the ocean. Everyone in the world lives in a watershed. Watersheds know no political borders, whether local, national or international. Our environment, our economy and our society all depend on a healthy watershed.
So for those of you who like to visualize things, hopefully that gave you a little bit of a visual idea of how a watershed is and how many things then can actually interact with or influence a watershed. So watersheds are part of our wider ecosystem, so all of the environment and all the things that interact with it, and provide us with really important services, like they help buffer our shorelines, they help absorb floodwater. They also provide our drinking water, which is pretty important. If we don't drink, we will die. Changes in precipitation, evaporation, air pollution, all of those kind of factors also influence both the quality and the amount of water that is in our different watersheds. What is important to note here is that there are signs and marks of a healthy watershed, and there are things, challenges or harms that can occur in a watershed that degrade the quality of water, both its amount and its form. And there are things that we can do as people in our communities that will help make our watershed move more towards a healthy watershed as opposed to a degraded or at-risk watershed. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about right now. Before we do that, I wanted to show you what watersheds, major watersheds we have throughout all of Pennsylvania. So I already mentioned, and I'm actually going to come over here so you can see, we live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which as you can see is this big watershed right here. Very big. It takes up most of the state. And that's why you'll hear a lot of talk about the Chesapeake Bay and all of the things that we can do. The Chesapeake Bay actually runs across multiple states. So it starts up in New York, tracks down through Pennsylvania, ends up down in Maryland, and even into a bit of Virginia. So it's a massive watershed. And so the actions that we take across the Chesapeake are incredibly important. But we also have some other watersheds across the state. So we have the Delaware, which is over here to the very east. We have Erie up in the north, which is connected to the Great Lakes. We have the Ohio, which eventually runs all the way down and into the Gulf. And then we also have the Potomac. So I share all this to say that what we do, the way that we steward our pieces of watershed that are here in Pennsylvania, have impacts that exceed well beyond the borders of Pennsylvania itself. And so not only is it important that we steward our local water and resources because it helps keep our community safe and healthy, it also has a lot of impact on our downstream neighbors. So going back to that justice piece of caring about our communities and caring about each other, we have a responsibility to make sure that the water in our local community stays clean and healthy, not just for ourselves, but also for others that we live with in the human family. Now, maybe you're asking by now, well, you talked about big watersheds and then also sub-watersheds. So this is a really cool tool that we're not going to have time to really dive into today, but I will just show you, and then you can actually follow this link if you would like to. You can actually put your address in, and it will show you exactly where we are. So this is a map that was put together by our friends at the Lancaster Conservancy. It includes each of the smaller sub-watersheds that are in the entirety of Lancaster County. Let's see if There we go. All right, so what I wanted to point out is that here at Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren, we are in what sub-watershed? Maybe some of our friends in the room might know.
It was Conowago goes to, not Conowago, what's it goes
Conoy.
to now? Conoy.
Kanoy, yep, that's the one. So, and I believe that's right here, yeah. So we found ourselves right here on the map, the Kanoy Creek. And this little tool will also let you know a couple of neat things, including how many projects have been completed recently within the local area in support of healthier streams, and how much of the stream length of all of the smaller tributaries that run through Kanoy have been restored, how much riparian buffer zone there is, and whether there's any water quality monitoring projects happening, which according to this right now, it looks like there are none. So whether you live in the Kanoy watershed or you come from a little bit further away, or maybe you're not even located in Lancaster County, this tool is specifically for Lancaster County, but there are tools similar to it for across the state. But this one, if you are local here in Lancaster, has a couple of extra nice features that you might want to explore. So functioning watersheds provide us with a number of really important things, including biodiversity. They provide us with our food, medicine, climate regulation, which is incredibly important, and we'll talk more about in a moment, woodland, and also healthy soil. So basically all of the key ingredients that make our lives possible to be lived happily and healthily are all tied back to watersheds and how healthy our watershed is. So without healthy watersheds, we risk losing things like our access to fresh grown food, vegetables, the like, clean water and air, which is really important, our wildlife, which we think about ourselves as separate from the animal world, but really, if they don't exist, we can't either. So we are in a symbiotic relationship, and their existence is important to our own. And our forests. All of those things are put at risk when our watershed is not healthy. So healthy watershed feels like a little bit like a big abstract term. What does that even mean? Does that mean that if I look at my stream and it looks dirty on a particular day, then it's unhealthy? And if I look at it and it looks clean, then everything is fine? Unfortunately not. Watersheds are pretty complex scientific things, but they have a couple of basic things that we can all know, and things that we can do to help make them healthier. So because watersheds, so remember, watershed, if you think about it like a bath, it collects water, all of it ends up in one point. So anything that gets collected in the water across those various points eventually will end up in that one place. So we have collection of pollutant particles, maybe good, maybe bad, all along the way. And then eventually all of it is going to end up in one centralized location, which means you're getting all of those impacts from all of those individual places once they get to one final resting place, magnified by so much, right? So one additional piece that I'll add to this, which maybe if you're more of a scientist person in the room, you're like, well, what about groundwater? Doesn't some of our water stay? It doesn't all go away? And you are right. And so the health of a watershed is also incredibly important to the health of our groundwater supply too. So as if you keep up with kind of watershed health and information like I do, you'll often hear that there are cases where there's been fracking or oil out across Pennsylvania, where then the water supply and groundwater has been contaminated. And so people who lived off of their own wells for many years are no longer able to drink that water. And so that wasn't, it's within the watershed. It's not necessarily going to leach elsewhere, but it is impacting that groundwater supply, which may be used for drinking or for agricultural purposes or the like. One final piece that I'll add to watersheds is the amount of infiltration that occurs within a watershed. So we have our groundwater and we have water that moves through our watershed, but to a final destination, right? But if there is a difference between how much water the ground can hold and how much gets transported downstream, once the ground can't hold anymore, anything extra that falls is going to end up downstream too and can cause overwhelm like flooding. So I don't know, have any of you seen pictures of the Susquehanna with all of the rain that we've recently had? Like the banks has been overflown. Not so much up in Harrisburg, but once you get further down towards Lancaster. And so again, you see that the further downstream we go, you're going to see more of those effects of that lack of the ground to hold all of the water. Now, why did so much water fall? Why is the ground not able to pick it up? Those are some of the things that we can identify and name as challenges to a healthy watershed. So remember that I said that climate regulation is a really important piece of watersheds. So climate change actually presents one of the biggest challenges to our watersheds. So climate change just simply refers to significant changes in weather patterns over any period of time. So if you look at the science from the 1970s until now, or even further back to pre-industrial, you can see we are on a climbing trajectory where our trend over time is hotter and hotter. Now, in addition to that heating up also has other weather implications, like the seasonal cycles and the way that rain falls, how much falls at a time. And so as our air, as our climate is warming up due to all of the different factors that are influencing climate change, which could be its whole own other presentation, we are seeing those impacts impact our watersheds too. So when the temperature rises, more water is going to evaporate, which means that the atmosphere is holding more of the water than it has historically. And so what that means is two things. It means that there's increase of drought. And then when rain does fall, it falls in amounts that are greater than the capacity of a local region to absorb a lot of that water. So it's going to cause bigger things like flooding, bigger impacts downstream, or even within our local communities, because smaller tributaries are not designed for that amount of water to fall. So a couple of other challenges that can get in the way of a healthy watershed or cause challenges is stormwater. So this ties in a little bit to climate change, which is why we put climate change first, because we want to explain why the weather patterns are changing and how that impacts our watersheds. But then beyond that, whenever more intense precipitation falls, we experience a higher amount of stormwater runoff. And so runoff is just a fancy way of saying that there is a piece of ground that historically would have been able to absorb water that is not able to absorb water anymore for any particular reason. So this church building and the parking lot that's outside used to be a place where water could just seep into the ground. It no longer can. So all of the water that falls across this space has to run off somewhere else. That is simply the word that we use to describe that is stormwater runoff. And so, like I already shared, even in a healthy watershed, that excess of runoff from one place can overwhelm those tributaries, leading to overwhelm downstream. It also can collect lots more pollutants. So like all of the roofs, the air pollution particles are going to sit on those roofs, be washed up by the rain into our waterways. A couple of other challenges that come particularly through stormwater runoff is think about some of the things that we use on our lawns, for example, so fertilizer. How often do you see people go out and apply fertilizer and then you see it rain? And all of that fertilizer doesn't even stay on its lawn, it ends up in our waterways as well. You see chemicals from cars, oil, and also things like animal feces and trash. I'm always seeing trash in the waterways, right? All of those things are usually, sometimes they're directly littered by people, but for the most part, what you're seeing happen is stormwater runoff in its course is picking up those pieces of trash, picking up those pollutants, and dropping them off and depositing them into our waterways. So remember how I talked about the bathtub? So watersheds really do act like that giant drain. And so all of those pollutants do end up in a centralized place or end up littered along the way of that place and cause significant harm to our watershed. One piece that doesn't maybe feel as connected to us here, but I think is important, is some of the coastal impacts and the receding coastline that we see, which is also a piece of our watersheds and the challenges they experience. So again, because of climate change, we are seeing sea level rise in a way that is unprecedented and historic. And so the more that seawater levels rise, we see those coastlines change. And where that's important is that we're starting to see more places where salt water and fresh water are compromised, right? So we have very little fresh water. Sources say between like 1% to 3% of water in the world is actually fresh water. So fresh water is drinking water. Salt water is ocean water. It's great for a number of purposes, not so good for drinking unless we desalinate it. And so what we risk as those seawater continues to rise as an effect of global warming, we start to see our freshwater bodies become contaminated with further salt water, which also provides an additional challenge to a healthy watershed. All right, one last one, and then we'll move to discussion. I already talked about pollution and some of the ways that our watersheds can experience pollution. Trash is a really big one. Agricultural runoff is a really big one in Lancaster County. In all of the Chesapeake Bay, Lancaster County still contributes one of the biggest loads to the entire Chesapeake Bay. And what that simply means is that we contribute a disproportionate amount of the entire pollution that ends up throughout the entire watershed. Microplastics is also a really important one. So there's all the trash we can see, but then there's also all the particles that we can't. And so sometimes water can look healthy and clean and it's still compromised. Sewage overflows, which is important, particularly if you live in Lancaster City or Harrisburg, we have combined sewage overflows, which means whenever there's a bigger rainstorm, remember we're experiencing more frequent, bigger, unprecedented rainstorms. The combined sewer system means that all of the feces and sewage is actually going to end up being channeled into our waterway once the system is overwhelmed. Tires are also incredibly common in watersheds, which sometimes surprises people. If you've been out and ever done a river cleanup, you are probably not surprised by that. But abandoned tires play a really disproportionate role in harming our watersheds too. And one piece that's very specific to Pennsylvania, not only to Pennsylvania, but is a challenge that we have here, is also abandoned mine drainage. So there's somewhere between 2,500 to 3,000 untapped wells across the state of Pennsylvania. So that's where a company has come in, decided to look for oil, either extracted the oil or has abandoned the project because it wasn't financially valuable and has not done the cleanup work. What you may not know is that taxpayers foot the bill for that in the Commonwealth. So that's a separate issue, but what that does mean is that in terms of watershed challenges, abandoned mine drainage does end up in our waterways as well. And you see this particularly out towards Pittsburgh, where you'll see that the rivers that run are like literally orange. And so that presents a very big challenge to our waterways, to a healthy watershed. So now we will have a discussion question. Again, we will just choose one of the questions for the sake of time. And so I'm wondering if you would like to turn to your neighbor and have a conversation for a moment or two about something that you learned or know harms the watershed, and why that particular thing is challenging, and or why you feel particularly called to protect or work around that particular issue. So, for example, I know friends who love watersheds very deeply, and the issue that they've chosen to care about and work around is abandoned mine drainage, because it's something that not many people know about, and so that's the thing that they choose to work on. So take a moment, turn to your neighbor, ask them what caught their attention and why that particular thing feels important to them in the communal responsibility that we all have to keep our watershed safe.
It's not all bad. There's law there and a lot of money given by the state. For what I read, a lot less coming out of it. It's just recently than it was in the past, because
Somebody pointed that out. Oh, yeah, I never thought of that.
So this is just about the farm runoff. Everybody's saying, drive around in the neighborhood and say, wow, look at all that. Right now. It's just in the last year. And that's out in the open. Now we're having a lot of rains. And so it's down, the river is down.
That's water.
Yeah.
All the water there. And my ancestors.
No, I was kind of seeing the sheds.
All of our underwater and then the groundwater. A lot of aquifers are drying up.
So all that stuff.
Nervous.
I've also heard a bit about micro nano.
When the church service, I smash it.
Around 30, 40 years in my life.
All right, 30 seconds.
Cold water. Cold water. Those are two different things. They actually realize.
All right, so we've been flying through all of this curriculum this morning, but we spent a moment talking about the call of faith communities to think about and interact with water and justice and what that looks like in our communities. Then we talked about the context, which is well, like, what is a watershed and why does it really matter? Do we need to pay attention to our watersheds? Can we just leave that to the people that's job is to do that? The answer is, hopefully you've figured out by now, no, it's going to take a community. It takes all of us being responsible and taking responsibility for the health of our watershed. And so I didn't want to leave you without talking a little bit about what does it look like to build a watershed conscious community? What would it look like for Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren to continue to become a place that is conscious of your community around you, and the ways that this building, the different meetings and events you hold are having an impact on the local watershed that you live in. So we're going to talk about a couple of different things that are all things that you can think about doing as a community and also as individuals. I want to contextualize this piece by saying that it takes all of these things and more for us to have a healthy watershed. Things like legislation, things like community accountability, and all of those things as well. We picked some things today that are really focused on more of the conservation side, or the individual practices that you can hold. And all of these things are really important, but that doesn't mean that these are the only things that are going to solve the issues and the challenges that we face. Nor does it mean that we have to personally figure out how to do every single one of these things. So what I would encourage you to do is to think about what are the couple of things that you can do, whether they're things that are represented on this screen or things that you're feeling called to or inspired on your own to continue to the health of our watershed. So water conservation up in the top corner is really important. So we often use a lot of fresh water and it's already really limited in supply. How often do we like turn on the faucet while we're washing the dishes and just let it go down the drain while we turn away and tend to something else, or we leave it on while we're brushing our teeth? So there are ways that you can actually even just intentionally decrease the amount of fresh water that you are actually using. So you can use low flow toilets and shower heads. If you have leaky pipes, you can get those fixed. Collecting water in rain barrels, which we'll talk more about in a moment, but that's one way to conserve water too. And then what I just mentioned, washing dishes and brushing teeth without leaving the faucet running. If you're not actually using the water for anything, consider turning it off. What's really important to know about using less water is that also uses less energy. So whenever you turn on your faucet to bring water into your home, you're also consuming electricity. So you're also putting additional burden on the grid as well. And so that also is having an impact on climate change. So by being more intentional about the way that you consume materials and resources, you're actually having a wide impact on a number of different areas in which we are facing challenges today. Safe disposal is also really important. I mentioned that tires often end up in watersheds, and that's often not because someone actually intentionally dumped them there, but because they didn't dispose of them properly. So making sure that you dispose of household trash and waste is really important. So picking up pet waste when you take your pets on walks is really important. Household chemicals, making sure that those are disposed of properly. You're not just leaving them out or leaving those bottles in places where they can end up in our waterways. And then also oils, pouring them down the sink and pouring them down the sink or into storm drains is really, really not good. I don't know if you've ever been out in your community and seen someone pouring oil down the stormwater drain. I've seen it happen. That's not the place for it to go. All of the storm drains throughout our neighborhoods channel directly into our watersheds. There's no secondary place where there's no plant that it all goes to before it ends up in our waterways. It just goes directly there. One other thing that you can think about is composting. So if you're not already composting or don't even know what that is, we don't have a lot of time to get into it this morning, but composting is a great way to reduce waste and also create fertilizer for your soil. So if you like to garden, it's a great alternative and it's a great way to reduce the amount of overall materials that end up in landfill. And landfill is one of the ways that our watersheds get contaminated too. Restoring habitat is also a really important piece. So we need to remove things that are harming our watersheds, and we also need to add things that will increase the health of our watershed. So planting native trees, pollinators, all of those kind of good things, which plug. If you are looking to plant native trees, we just opened up our request form for the spring. And so if you have some land or know someone who does that would like to plant some trees with us this spring, you can get those at no cost through our program. And we do that in partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and a wonderful group of volunteers. Any work that you can do to reduce the total amount of lawn and impervious surface that you either own, it would be those things are really important too. Lawns offer no benefit either to wildlife and to our watersheds. People assume that they're really good places for the rain to soak up, and actually what happens is water just kind of moves across them like a sheet when there's a heavy rain downfall. So doing things like plantings, native plants in particular, is a really great way to capture more of that rain into the ground. So lawns, we would love to see less of those. And then the amount of impervious surfaces. So you have a lot of impervious surface here. It's a really big parking lot. So thinking about where all of that water goes and if there are any ways that you can work to retain some more of that so it doesn't all end up as much of it in your local watershed is really important. Community garden projects are also a great way to build community, increase fresh food access, and also help promote healthier watersheds. One piece that people don't often think about when we talk about healthy watersheds is the importance to transport mindfully. So there is a very big carbon footprint associated with the way that we travel. We typically use oil cars. And that has an impact on both climate and also on our watersheds. And so thinking about commuting differently, if that's an accessible option to you, is a really important part of improving the health of our community. So if you live in a walkable neighborhood, walking instead of taking the car is a great option. And then also if public transport is accessible to you, that's also a great thing to consider. Or if you're going on a family trip for the day, maybe you can go to a local park and take a walk instead of driving for 4 hours. So all of those different things, being more mindful and intentional about the way that we're using particularly vehicles and opting for cleaner options wherever we have them. Those kind of options can also be great for your wallet too. We talked a little bit about reducing impervious surfaces. So things like roads and parking lots, sidewalks, and sports fields are all key examples of places where water is not entering the ground like it once did. And so any measures that can be taken to convert either pieces of that impervious surface back to pervious surface, or increasing capture technology. So we'll talk a little bit more about green infrastructure in just a second. But for example, putting in a rain garden so that it can capture some of that runoff, store it in a bioretention, and then slowly let that be released at a later time. Those kind of technologies are really important and can really make a difference in the total amount of water that ends up in our watersheds and the amount of pollutant load that does as well. We talked about the challenge of trash. Trash pickup is a great way to build community. I see congregations do this frequently. Children particularly enjoy it a lot, and it's a great way to learn more about your local neighborhood. So for some of you, maybe you live in walking distance of the community, but some of you maybe have never even met any of the neighbors that are right nearby here. And so walking the streets, picking up trash, people come out and say hello. It's a great way to meet your neighbors. And so it's a community building practice as well as a way to decrease the impact of trash on our watersheds particularly. Rain barrels are also great. All a rain barrel is, they can get real fancy in their technology, but really all it is it's a big old bucket that you use to capture some rain, usually not direct fall. It's usually coming off of a roof or some kind of impervious surface. And it's not necessarily designed to, it can have a functional use. So some people will use them to water their garden, although you have to be careful that the water doesn't get gunky. But you can also just use it as a capture and release method. So if there's a heavy rainfall, you keep collecting a couple of barrels and then slowly letting that out when there's some more dry days helps to balance out that disbalance that we've created through temperature rising, which is that much more water falls in one period of time than the ground can actually reasonably soak up. So trash pickups and rain barrels, we wanted to pick out and highlight as particular activities that are really great for communities that are looking for ways to both engage their local community, make a difference, and also do something that impacts the health of their watershed. A couple of the things I've already talked about are green infrastructure, but green infrastructure can be something as simple technically as a rain barrel, all the way up and through like whenever they build a big new road or highway or a big new shopping center, the way that they design the whole facility and the way that water gets channeled across the impervious surfaces. Any new projects that are being put together here in Lancaster County often have some kind of green infrastructure requirement, which means you'll often see rain garden beds or bioretention facilities or different things like that. They're all big fancy words just to say we're slowing down the amount of water that hits the creek, tributary, stream, the river in the event of a bigger rainfall, to slow that down to hopefully provide less overwhelm and less pollution by the time we get downstream. So those are a couple of the things, and I am right skirting on that time. So instead of having a final discussion, I will take a moment for if there's any brief questions. I'm happy to also stay around and chat. I don't know how long there is between this and the next service.
15 minutes.
Okay. So I have a moment to answer some questions if people have them. I also, if you do need to run, I have a short feedback form that I would be so grateful if you would take a moment and fill it out. And if you could do me a favor and also just write your zip code on the feedback form. I don't need your name or anything like that. And you're welcome to fill out as little or as much as you want, but the zip code helps us to capture what communities or what zip codes we've covered in our teaching, so that when we send our report back, we can tell them the different places that people live throughout the state who've heard this curriculum or teaching from us. Any questions? Thoughts that people have? If not, I'd be happy to hear more about things that your community has been doing here. I know that Damon and Beth and Paul have all been doing and thinking a lot around this work, and I'm always happy to hear how communities are thinking about this in their local context.
You hear a lot about plastic grocery bags and how they end up in the ocean. I'm curious, I can't quite picture how they will all get there. And more importantly, if I use plastic bags but take them to the recycle barrel at the grocery store, am I avoiding that part of the problem, or do those bags still cause troubles?
It really depends. They can end up there in a lot of ways. Some of it truly is just from, you know, shopping bag falls out of your car as you're driving home, or plastic bag ends up from. What I often see happen, so in my neighborhood where I live, people put all their trash out on trash day, and I live right where the water from both sides of the neighborhood comes down and meets. And so what often happens on trash day is if there's a rain that day, I see all of the stuff that blew off people's trash buckets. And so I'll often go out and pick that up. And so sometimes it really just does happen because through like the natural causes of people's trash and wind and stuff, it blows in. But then we also are seeing cases of like large amounts of recycling being just left at sea. So what happens is the contract goes bad between parties, between the party that's trying to get rid of the trash and the party that has committed to doing the recycling of it. And so there are large barrels or like shipping containers that just sit out at sea. And so those often will then break down. And so that trash ends up in our waterways as well. So it's a little bit of a multiple scenario thing. I would say that if you know exactly where your plastic bag is going, then like that's the best case scenario. But honestly, the best case scenario is just to opt for something other than plastic, because the ongoing production of plastic is also causing, just beyond the watershed impacts, causing major damage to the climate. And so ongoing use of petrochemicals is like one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the 21st century. So the less that you can use plastic bags, the better. Is the short answer.
Yeah, one thing I think is important about water use is the billions and billions of gallons of water we're using for fracking. They're taking fresh water that's collected over millions of years of history, and we're using it all up to frack for oil we don't really shouldn't be using. You know, in the long term, it's warming the climate, but it's also, when you got retention ponds from fracking, they can break, and who's responsible when it pollutes? So there's a lot of, I think fracking is a very important issue. We need to hit the government on in subsidizing that.
And I think this is where like working on watershed issues is such a great way into like wider environmental care and work and stewardship, because you can't work on just increasing native habitat on its own or increasing the health of a watershed on its own. It is connected to pollution and to our economics and what we choose to export and what we choose to value as our communities. And so it really is important that we take that collective approach, which is part of the reason why when we started building this curriculum, the first section really emphasizes how faith communities are talking to both water issues and then also to justice issues, because I think there's a really important connection that we need to make of our overall responsibility to each other. And that extends well beyond just making sure that we have buffered streams in our communities.
Yeah, people wanting to trickle out, I guess. So
I think they have.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are trickling. So thank you for
Thank you for
coming.
being here.
So I can't turn off the recording because I don't have the recording button. I guess we should be done here. Maybe this is it.
Nicely done, Kate.
Yes, thank you.
Very nice.